What's up, my fellow scruffy looking nerf herders, and welcome to the Carbonite Chat. Today I want to be talking about trilogies and why I think they no longer work. This got brought up by Kathleen Kennedy a few days ago, maybe a week ago, saying that once Rise of Skywalker is over with, they're no longer going to be doing the three stories, the trilogy style, the basic format that's been kind of tried and true for many, many years. Now, I disagree that it's tried and true, and I'll get to that point, and I want to kind of try to show how those that have made it work, there's specific things that they've done differently that's caused it to still work. But I think if you look throughout all time, even trilogies that were great have one movie in them that does not work, that doesn't pay off. Rise of Skywalker, I mean, obviously I don't like the entire trilogy. I think as a whole it fails completely. But Rise of Skywalker, you could clearly tell that there was an issue where it was almost like they were trying to tell too much in the final story. It was so convoluted because they were trying to get across so many new information, so much new details in that final story that it just didn't work as a whole. Now, there's going to be some people that enjoy it, obviously, because they're going to kind of turn off their brain to some of the issues and stuff and just sit back as a popcorn flick and just watch the explosions and stuff going on. And that's fine, that's great for them. But I argue that even they who may not care about some of the more minute details or how the story really functions, that they would enjoy it even more so when you get to do it properly. And I think doing it properly is 4 stories. Now, my first kind of reason why I believe that no longer works for trilogies anymore is because of TV shows. Nowadays, TV shows have completely changed the audience that they have. Nowadays, it's much younger people. We don't have these old kind of soap opera shows. We don't have the sitcom style. I mean, we still have all of those, but that's not what's kind of blown up. With shows like The Walking Dead, even though it's died off now. And then you have Game of Thrones, obviously. You have Doctor Who's really popular. Obviously, shows like Breaking Bad. All of these shows that ironically now are now having panels each year at Comic-Con. Something that before was kind of saved for the Marvel, DC, Star Wars, these types of movies. This and the popularity of a lot of the Marvel miniseries that they've been running, as well as the popularity now of The Mandalorian, where you have 8 episode arcs of the character that are expressed in our shows running to about 8 hours of time. If you look in by comparison to the average time of some of these Marvel or Star Wars movies, the typical movie trilogy type franchise movie is around 2 hours to 2 hours and 20 minutes. That leaves you with an hour to 2 hours short of time. Again, as I said, my point is ultimately going to be that there should be 4 movies now instead of 3. The reason with these TV shows, and I think it's very clearly shown in The Last Jedi and then in Rise of Skywalker, is in TV shows now, especially with something like Game of Thrones, where there's all these twists and turns, and then there's so many characters, and each character has a very, very deep story by the time we get to it, and we feel like we know them very well. That desire now comes back into movies. We can't change that with Netflix and stuff like that, where we can watch over a long period of time. We now have the ability or desire to want to take in so much broader of a story and get into some of the more minute details of each character so we understand them more, which connects us more emotionally, thus causing us to be more attached and like sitting there and waiting to the end in full excitement. When you do a trilogy of movies, it really comes from Sid Fields, who's kind of the father of screenplays in Hollywood. He wrote the book Screenplay. He kind of set out a 3-act structure as the best way to kind of plot out a movie. But I argue if you look at the way he structured it, he laid out 3 acts, but then in the second act, he has 2 pinch points that he put. And I think this is kind of the idea that should be followed when you're creating 4 movies. The beginning of the movie, you have the middle of it, you have the obstacle that they've got to get over, and then you've got the climax. Well, if you look at the 3 movies and trilogies of old, they all had one movie largely that didn't work as well as the rest of them. The original trilogy is a perfect example. The first 2 movies, absolutely brilliant. Return of the Jedi, it seemed like it could have actually done better separated into 2 movies. It almost feels like 2 movies kind of jammed into one, with the story of trying to free Han and what's going on over at Jabba's versus where you actually end up with the final battle over Endor. Same if you look with something like The Godfather. Not one of the franchise movies, but one of the greatest movies of all time. The first Godfather and the second Godfather. Absolute beautiful, beautiful movies. Some of my favorite movies of all time. Then you get to The Godfather Part 3, and it's absolutely terrible. I'll show one more example of a trilogy not working, and hopefully I'll use it to prove my point for why really the 4 stories works best. And it'll actually be by showing you one movie that should have been 2 stories. But it fits with what I'm trying to explain, and that's The Hobbit. The Hobbit tried to force in a 3rd story so that it could get its trilogy, when ultimately it would have been so much better to just stick to 2 movies. And if you're going to do the 2-movie story, you would have a beginning in the middle, and then the first half of the second movie would be the obstacle that they're trying to overcome, and finally the climax. So instead of having you cut off with Smaug flying over to the city, where you're at your emotional peak storytelling wise, and then you have to wait a year and show back up to the theaters, and then you just have what seems like an endless battle scene that goes on and on, but you've lost the emotional attachment to what's happening at this moment. It doesn't work. I couldn't even finish Battle of the Five Armies. But if you would have broken that up and got all the way up to Smaug, that'd be one movie, and then you have Smaug and the Battle of the Armies being the second movie, I believe that would have worked out just as brilliantly as the first trilogy did. And that's where I'll go into next, because obviously you're saying, but The Lord of the Rings was a trilogy and it worked brilliantly, and I completely agree. Even all the way up to the 3rd movie, which broke records at the time for the amount of Oscar awards that it got. It's 3 movies, but if you look at how long they are, each movie is so much longer than what typical movies are nowadays. The first movie was 3 hours, the second movie was 3 hours, and the third movie was 3 hours and 20 minutes. If you break up the storytelling time and break that into 4 movies, that's 2 hours and 20 minutes of total storytelling time, which is exactly the amount of time these Marvel, Star Wars, franchise style, the typical movie nowadays, if it's not a Scorsese movie, is going to be around 2 to 2.5 hours. So that works out perfectly. So even though it does, in a sense, prove my trilogies don't work idea, gives me backing to say that the reason most stories don't work is because it doesn't have enough time to explain out the characters and kind of express the world as a whole as much as audiences nowadays want from a story. You might be saying, what about the Marvel Cinematic Universe? It clearly has worked. I mean, it's made insane sums of money. But I argue that proves my point even more so. If you look at the characters, and there's Iron Man, Thor, all these that actually have full trilogies, Captain America, all of them, minus Captain America actually, end up having one movie at least that really doesn't work. And it's either really strong at the beginning or really strong at the end, in Thor's example. I still argue that even if they all work like Captain America did, its usage and connection to other trilogies outside of itself increase the storytelling time for that character and the plots that you can use in your actual trilogy that make it fit much more with a 4-story format. And finally, Marvel again proves my point totally and completely with Avengers, the last 2 setting records, the final one blowing everything out of the water. That's 4 stories. You have the first Avengers, you've got Age of Ultron, you've got Infinity War, and then you have Endgame. It's 4 movies. It's exactly what I said. And it fits exactly how that beginning, middle, obstacle, climax. You have the beginning where you're going to meet all your characters. They're going to need to come into this new world, realize a challenge that they haven't seen before, that then causes them to accomplish or become something more than they were at the beginning. For the Avengers, we already have them all as superheroes, but it's this challenge that they haven't seen. The fact that, almost like in the hero's journey, stepping into a new world, in this sense, the new world is that another world comes into theirs, realizing that, we can handle everything that's going on now. We didn't need to join together, put our problems to the side, and work hand in hand to defeat someone until we had this whole new challenge that we could have never expected, the new world. That's the beginning. They finally come together at the end, they accomplish that task, and now you think it can work as a whole. First movies of a trilogy or 4 stories should be able to work in and of itself completely. It's one heroic journey as a whole. But if you're telling a further story like a trilogy, or in this case, as I'm saying from now on, should be 4 stories, you have this middle where now new challenges arise. In the middle one, this should be a lot of fun. It should be an expression of the very beginning, especially of the second movie, and this is exactly what Age of Ultron does. Even though Age of Ultron isn't that good, it does at the beginning express the way it should, which is we've got these new powers, we're dominant, and it's going to show. Let the audience enjoy seeing this new team together that they wanted to see from the beginning. They wanted to see their heroes become something new. Now let's see them kind of flash. Let them show off all their capabilities, and that's exactly what it did. But then in that middle part, the challenges are going to rise to a point that it causes them and shows and reveals that maybe they're not fully complete on their hero's journey. They just thought they were. And this is exactly what Age of Ultron does. It starts to split the team. They feel that because of these powers, they have to begin to do different things. Obviously with Iron Man and Captain America, and this is really expressed in Civil War. But in Civil War, even though they win in Age of Ultron, they did not change completely into the way they did. They separated again, having different ideologies on what is best to do, but they actually returned back to their problem they had at the beginning of the first movie, which is they weren't working together. That's when the third movie you institute an obstacle, a huge challenge that actually defeats them, forcing them to make that final change. And again, in Avengers Endgame does this perfectly with Thanos. They couldn't kind of just throw everything together at the end. They're actually all working separately as the movie goes on, and they get defeated. This forces them to not just change from jumping to new skills and ability that you see in the first half of the stories and the 2 stories, but where they've also got to change on the inside, which is going to end up making them a more complete and total character in the end, making a complete character arc and hero's journey where they are a full and complete hero at the end, thus which happens in Avengers Endgame, where they finally work out their issues, they come together, they solve the problems that they need to solve inside themselves, which allows them to join together as new complete characters, thus allowing them to beat the obstacle that defeated them beforehand. And that's how the movie should work. That is how these stories should be able to be structured, and why I think TV shows and miniseries are so popular nowadays. And with the popularity of those and the twists and turns that you can't do in a 3-act movie, while also giving the depth you need, while also building out a villain that is understood and works in the movie, plus adding all these multiple side characters in and giving them enough depth that you care and you're emotionally attached, so at the end you're at the edge of your seat on whether or not these characters are going to die. 3-act story, 3-story trilogies no longer can really pull that off, unless they're going to start doing 3.5-hour long movies like Lord of the Rings, but they're not going to do that because of the companies like Disney that want to make as much money as possible. And if you're sitting through a 3.5-hour long movie, that means there's less times you're going to go back to the movies, or there's less showings that they can show at the theater. If you've got a 10-hour period of time and you've got a 3.5-hour movie, you can only show the movie 3 times. If it's 2.5-hour long movie, you can show it 4 times. That means more money. They're going to do that every time. So we have to do 4-story movies going forward. Anyways, I hope you like that. I'd like to hear your thoughts down below, where I might be wrong, some trilogies I might have missed, where they actually work, or maybe some ways that it might be improved on. Maybe a 5-act structure would be best. I just think looking at what we've seen so far, 4 stories are what works best. And in case you're going to throw in something like the Hunger Games, where they threw in these 4 stories right at the end, my argument is that that was just a money-making decision at the very end. The movies weren't pre-set out and structured to be 4 stories. They made 2 movies from 2 books, and then they said, let's split the third one up into 2 things. And it goes along with a lot how Hobbit was, where it should have just been 2, but they said, let's split it up until the final one is separated emotionally from the rest of the story. And it just seems like a bunch of actions and explosions, but you're not really that emotionally connected. But anyways, look forward to seeing your comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and never forget, you Nerf herders, I love you.